Hello everyone, my name is William Wood. This is week 4, Sociology of Crime. This week we look at crime as sickness, biological and psychological explanations of crime, of course through a sociological lens. So this week we have 3 shorter lectures. Our first lecture today, this lecture looks at positivism and biological explanations of crime, and also looks at Lombroso and early biological theories. In particular, in relation to the rise of what we call, what's commonly referred to as eugenics, a term that we'll explore in more detail in this lecture. Lecture 2 will look at early psychological theories of crime, Lombroso's colleague Garofalo and the Italian school. And lecture 3 this week will look at contemporary biosocial and psychological theories, including sociological perspectives on the criminal personality and some criticisms of trait theory. So let's go ahead and get started with our first lecture. This week we see a shift from the classical explanations of week 3, which argued that crime was by and large a product of rational decision-making on the part of offenders who weighed up the risks versus the rewards and made a calculated decision. We move into the world of positivism this week. Positivism is an approach that argues that to understand a social phenomenon, it's not enough to rationalize it. It's not enough to make rational assertions. Rather, the appropriate approach is empiricism. This is the beginning of the scientific method. All right? So its philosophical origins come in the work of this guy here, Auguste Comte. Comte argued in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, that somewhat similar to the natural sciences, so the biological sciences, earth sciences, so on, that we should think of the study of social activity or human activity as a science of society. So instead of depending on philosophical speculation, rationalism, religion, or other approaches that sought to explain human behavior, it would be best, he argued, in fact the only real way we could know it is by attempting to emulate the scientific method. So he proposed this term positivism as a way to move from metaphysical claims of social knowledge to scientific knowledge of the social world. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines positivism then as a system of philosophy elaborated by Auguste Comte from 1830 onwards, which recognizes only positive facts and observable phenomenon. Right? This is the world of empiricism. Knowledge in this sense is only what we can observe, we can measure, we can then move directly into the scientific method that we talked about at the beginning of our week 3 lecture, in terms of things like forming a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, comparing it against existing knowledge, developing theories, and so on. So a positivistic approach within criminology looks at ways, historically, emerging in the 1800s, looked at ways in which first biological and then psychological and then eventually environmental as well, pathologies can be understood and confronted through scientific methodology. In this regard, the sociologist Stephen Fole has noted the positivist approach represented a, quote, antithetical critique of classical attempts to explain crime as the willful, premeditated, and controllable act of a rational human being. Again, the movement from this classical approach, which explains crime as a calculation, a rational offender, into the world of people who are driven by forces that they can't understand, compulsions, aggression, lack of self-control rooted in biological and or psychological pathologies within the individual. So this represents in many ways the rise of the Italian school. And this figure here, Cesare Lombroso, whom we've discussed already in week 1, in the 19th century, as we mentioned at the conclusion of last week, sees a shift from this classical or rational or economic model of crime and crime control towards biological and then later psychological explanations of crime. So Lombroso publishes this work, The Criminal Man, in 1876, and its impact is profound. It is undoubtedly the single most influential or important book in the history of criminology, even though, as we'll discuss a little bit later, many of his conclusions are now considered unscientific or pseudoscientific but he sets forth a framework of scientific investigation, and he also changes in many ways the direction or focus of criminology out of this classical or out of this rationalistic approach into the then nascent but beginning world of empirical study of crime and other social phenomenon. So he studies the cadavers of executed criminals, and he spends time researching offenders in prison as well. He comes up with the conclusion that crime is probably serious criminal activity, probably an inherited trait. This term pathological, also here, Oxford English Dictionary definition. When we say pathological, we mean relating to or dealing with disease, or relating to the science of pathology. So we see disease, we see abnormality in properties or behaviors as becoming the explanatory factors for human behavior, including criminal behavior. In this regard, early positivist approaches were largely biological. Pathologies were thought to be rooted in the physiology of the body itself, right? And these sought to demonstrate how human behavior, including crime, was physiologically determined. You would have undoubtedly heard of examples like Franz Josef Gall's phrenology, the notion that the contours or the shape of the skull could, at least in part, be used to predict or determine human behavior, things like aggression, things like self-control. But Lombroso sets forth himself a similarly biological deterministic concept called the atavist, right? The atavist he defines as a throwback to earlier evolutionary stage of development. And for this reason, his work is often called atavistic theory, for the notion that criminals could be identified by physical traits that in part explained their life of crime. So as I mentioned, this is classified as a form of biological determinism, meaning that one's biology or physiological characteristics can, at least in part, explain their social behaviors. Recently, this is, as we'll look at later in the term, makes its rise in the mid-late 1800s. The dominant perspective up through the 1920s and 1930s, and then really falls off the map for more than 50 years, 60 years. More recently made a comeback, or makes a comeback, that we'll talk about in Lecture 3 when we look at the relationship between genetics and crime. So for Lombroso, the atavist was identifiable by several prominent features: large jaws, forward projection of the jaw, low sloping foreheads, high cheekbones, flattened or upturned noses, handle-shaped ears, large chins, very prominent in appearance, hawk-like noses or fleshy lips, hard, shifty eyes, scanty beard or baldness, long arms. Obviously, when we look at these, we can see, for many of these terms, these are inherently subjective. We're not setting forth Lombroso's work as having much reliability or validity in terms of contemporary standards. However, his argument, as I mentioned, or his research, was incredibly influential in the day in terms of shifting the study of crime away from the speculative or the rationalistic perspectives into the scientific approach to the study of crime. So this concept of determinism then looks at criminologists and sociologists who use trait theories and see deviance in crime as a product of natural processes or causes. So then crime and deviance in this sense become dependent variables. It's not the rational actor making a choice, but rather a social actor who is in some sense constrained or compelled or pushed into particular types of action as a result of biological or psychological or even social influences beyond his or her control. Determinist perspectives they really, in some sense, have a lot of their grounding in the work of Charles Darwin's probably the single most important book in terms of the biological and social sciences in the last 200 years, Origin of the Species. Notable for Darwin's notion that differences between species are a result of successful adaptation, right? This should be a familiar argument to you. His cousin, Herbert Spencer, however, usurps and somewhat modifies Darwin's work, and in many ways, I think, Darwin is often misattributed for this phrase. So Herbert Spencer takes Darwin's work and attempts to apply it to human social settings. Right? Darwin's work to look at the evolution of species over longer periods of time. Herbert Spencer coins this phrase, survival of the fittest, and this is often confused or attributed to Darwin. But Spencer's notion of social Darwinism won wide popularity for the idea that genetics and proper breeding was the primary difference between social classes. So he takes Darwin's work, which is reflective of the natural world, and Spencer applies it to the social world to explain why the upper classes have the dominant positions, enjoy, the top of the social strata, largely as a result of, increased intelligence, proper breeding, so on. Today, positivism and post-positivism are terms used to refer to a number of methods and methodologies that rely on scientific observation and inquiry to explain crime. So it is best defined today as an epistemology. This is a term we've looked at before, but there's a link for you as well to explore. So those who seek scientific explanations for criminal or antisocial behavior as a result of biological and or psychological pathologies often group these, as I mentioned, under this rubric of trait theories. Early biological theories following Lombroso became more sophisticated. They developed increased empirical rigor, but they generally followed the framework and the assumptions set forth by Lombroso in his work, The Criminal Man. So Ernest Houghton, a prominent Harvard anthropologist, is one of the dominant criminologists of the early 20th century that elaborated on Lombroso's basic premises. He concludes in The American Criminal that criminals evidence signs of physiological organic inferiority. He suggests that crime was probably biological in origin, and again, we're talking serious crime. We're not talking stealing a candy bar when you were a child, but serious, prolonged, what we would call criminal careers or prolonged involvement in serious criminal activity. So he suggests that this type of crime is probably biological in origin, probably incurable, and the best option then was to remove criminals from society. William Sheldon, also categorized as a somewhat earlier biological theorist for his fairly rudimentary theory of body morphology and its relation to behavior. Those of you that are my age or older in the course would undoubtedly have been exposed to this in your grade school and high school health textbooks. This idea that endomorphs, ectomorphs, mesomorphs, etc. Body shape has something related to personality traits and characteristics. Coincidentally, Sheldon himself later accused, and I think widely regarded as having engaged in some less than upright behavior. There's a funny link for you. I often find it amusing when people that are involved in the production of knowledge about the deviance of others end up getting caught in similar situations themselves. So some of you might find that backstory on Sheldon interesting. So, his notion of endomorphs, mesomorphs, and ectomorphs was, influential on at least 2 generations, and was thought that these different typologies could at least in some part predict behavior. Today, this research is considered as junk science, pseudoscience. It's not taught anymore other than within a sociological concept to illustrate the misapplication of scientific method as a means of supposedly using biology to determine social behaviors. Charles Goring's work, The English Convict, is another example, probably the most rigorous empirically of the early biological theories. This was carried out on convicted prisoners. He avoids the mistake. He learns from Lombroso and avoids the mistake. One of the things that Lombroso didn't do is use any type of control group. But unlike Lombroso, Goring uses a control group of non-criminals. He's quite critical of Lombroso's methods, not critical of the scientific method, but rather of Lombroso's fairly unscientific application of method. So he's also critical of Lombroso's emphasis on abnormal physical characteristics. Although he did find physical differences, he argues the physical and mental constitution of both criminal and law-abiding persons of the same age, stature, class, and intelligence are identical. There's no such thing as an anthropological criminal type, argues Goring, meaning we can't simply observe somebody. There's no differences by which physiologically we can use to predict propensity for serious criminal activity. However, he's classified as a biological for the reason that he finds high correlations between the criminality of parents and children and between siblings. And he argues that there's what he calls a criminal correlation between father, sons, brothers. So makes the argument or makes the deduction that criminal tendencies present in the parents' genetics would be passed to the children. So here we're not talking about a physiology of criminality, we're talking about a heredity of criminality, passing on through the genes. Some problems with Goring's work: theorized poor mental ability might be passed on genetically, thus related to crime and deviance, but he offers no proof that intelligence is related to deviance, or in fact that it's inherited. Also, Goring did not adequately account for other obvious factors that might have played a role in his findings, some of which we'll look at throughout this term, but I imagine you can identify one or two on your own, particularly the role of social environment in determining things like educational outcomes, career opportunity, etc. So the early biological theorists, given the varying robustness of reliability and validity in their research, were quickly usurped by policymakers. I gave the example of the philosopher Herbert Spencer, quickly usurped by policymakers who sought to capitalize on this early biological research as a means of promoting the fitness or the health of nations, and as a means of attacking immigrant populations, indigenous populations, in the case of the United States, slave populations or freed slaves following the Emancipation Proclamation. This approach to the use of science was called eugenics. In the early 20th century, genetic theories of crime, of deviance, underlie or undergird much of the justification of genetics. So one of the famous research studies that supposedly proved the validity of genetics was this research here, and there's links to both the Jukes and the Kallikaks. They're both pseudonyms who were studied in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States, where it was found what appeared to be astonishingly high rates of deviant and criminal activity that could be traced back through many generations of these families. So this research initially lent support to the first wave of eugenics, so the idea that behavior, intelligence, and social success are largely inherited, and that the state has an obligation or responsibility to increase the fitness of a nation by encouraging reproduction of those that are superior and discouraging, or even in many cases forcibly, violently removing children from the state, or forced sterilization, things of this nature. This research today wholly discredited for both methodological reasons, as well as that for comparative studies of other non-degenerate families. There's a really famous one, I think I have a link down there, on the Kennedys, has shown similar rates of deviance in crime. So the reason we study this, the Jukes and the Kallikaks, isn't because it shows a definitive link between heredity and crime. It shows a definitive link between early theories of early biological theories of crime and offending, and the way that they're used by policymakers, by the media, by other people, to effectively wage war on lower class and particularly lower class minority populations. So this first wave of eugenics, 1880 to 1945, we think of this term as somewhat insidious, right? We have lots of sci-fi movies about, eugenic futures, or we think of the Nazis and their gross experiments. But in fact, eugenics wasn't a dirty word 100 years ago. It was on the front page of the New York Times, where huge philanthropic foundations openly supported white supremacy, openly supported policies that encouraged, the fitness of a nation, the fitness of families from good white middle or upper middle class neighborhoods or communities. Here we can see, to make race perfect. So this is, this should make our skin crawl, but I want to remind you, this is not ancient history. This is in a fairly recent past. So here we see social Darwinism as a part of US, British, and Australian progressive movements to improve society. And I think Australia often gets left out of this conversation, and the finger, first of all, goes most often to the Germans and their involvement in eugenics in World War II. Prior to World War II, the Americans and the British are heavily involved in promoting eugenic policy, limiting immigration, forced sterilization, public relations campaigns. But Australia as well, and there's a link to some Australian research on this. So these ideas originate in Britain, most heavily implemented in the United States, and then in World War II in Germany. And as I mentioned, the goal then to increase the fitness of a nation by increasing births and immigration among the fit, decreasing them among the unfit, including, as I already mentioned, segregation, sterilization, immigration restriction, marriage restriction laws, community education, and so on. So a major factor leading to the popularity of eugenics and forced sterilization was racism and racist ideologies. This early research, biological research on crime and criminal offending, looking at the role of feeble-mindedness, other less robust scientific concepts, was used to, heavily used to justify this racism and these racist ideologies. Applied in the US most commonly to Black Americans, obviously in Australia to Indigenous Australians. Also applied to Eastern and Southern European and Asian immigrants, thought to be inferior. Supported by many, many prominent social scientists, opposed by a much smaller group of scientists who were really rigorous in their application of scientific method, most notably the anthropologist Franz Boas. U.S. repealed sterilization in the 30s and 40s, although in some southern states this continued after. And the distastefulness in which we tend to speak of eugenics today doesn't come out of any kind of major consciousness shift as much as it comes from an effective propaganda campaign waged by the British and the Americans when they discover the German use of grotesque medical procedures as a means of promoting or exploring eugenics. So really the shift away from this overt public support for eugenics doesn't come out of any sense of wrongness other than the wrongness that's manufactured by the British and the Americans as an effective tool against the Germans in World War II. Okay, so that concludes our first of 3 lectures for this week, and we'll start off in the next lecture on early psychological theories before concluding in lecture 3 with some contemporary biological and psychological theories as well as critiques. So I look forward to talking to you then.